Welcome. I'm Gary Birch, University Professor Emeritus at the University of Georgia. It's October 4th, 2024, and I'm delighted to be here with Dr. Richard Cupitt at the Richard Russell Library on the University of Georgia campus. Rick, it's good to be with you again. Let's begin at the beginning. Tell us a little bit about where you were born and raised and how you ended up at the University of Georgia.
Sure. Thank you for the invitation, too, to get a chance to say nice things about the University of Georgia, because it's been a foundation in many ways of all that's happened to me. I was born in Frankfurt, Germany, and my father was in the military, and so he was stationed there shortly after World War II, was a few years after World War II, and so I lived the life of an Army brat, growing up in many, many different places, none of which were in Georgia, actually. But my father decided to retire in Milledgeville, Georgia, because some Army friends also were there. And so it came about that I started at another university, the University of North Carolina, but I was an out-of-state student, and they were raising the prices, and I couldn't afford it. So they said, University of Georgia, in-state. So I came many, many, many years ago now. And that life, early life of moving around a lot, was one of the reasons I really found a home here in many ways, and it was, comfortable here, and I enjoyed it. And I also learned here that you learned as much as you put in. So the Russell Library was the old one, certainly, and I see all the new ones, was fabulous. If you went there, there was a lot. A lot of information, and we had some really good professors, and they got me doing some very interesting things, and particularly, now my father had been in eventually came to command all the nuclear weapons in Southern Europe for the Army anyway. And so I was interested in tech and in a variety of domains, and came here and took a course with Dr. Birch many, many years ago on comparative communism. There were many communist states till then. And got interested in how technology was flowing between the United States and our allies and the former Soviet Union, and then the Soviet Union, and what that was all about. And that really got me interested in things and the technology transfer, and that became the basis of, I guess, my subject matter expertise originally, and I sustain that interest in technology transfer and technology to this day, and work on those issues.
And you're a true triple dog, including a PhD, and we're headed on an academic career. What happened? You tried academics, but ended up in Washington, D.C., and New York, and Vienna, and all over the world.
Well, I was very interested in the academic life. I enjoyed it, and went out teaching at another university, and actually several other universities. But then I heard that Dr. Birch was putting together a new center, or thinking about it at least, to focus more on these export controls on technology transfers, and how we manage technology transfer. And I knew he had support from former Secretary of State Dean Rusk. Had really encouraged this, and I had happened to spend a summer working here with the Secretary on a National Governors Association project, and he was very interested in it, and I thought, this might have more impact than what I was doing as a regular academic, and I thought, I think I want to have a little more impact on public policy, and that's how I ended up starting that, and developed, I would say, helped, I hope, the center become, certainly in its early years, the leading center for export control, studying export controls in the academic setting in the world. And that thanks to Dr. Birch and also the foundation support and other support that we got, and the many colleagues and friends. And I mentioned today at another meeting that some of the systems we developed there are actually still used by the State Department to this day. So it's, it was really interesting and important work. For a whole variety of reasons, mainly family reasons, I needed to move to Washington, D.C. And I was supported enough that we were able to open a SITS office. Now that was mainly in my home, but at least the first couple of years. And not the least because I sometimes would say, yeah, Georgia Tech has a whole building. So
and this is SITS, the Center for International Trade and Security, that Rick and I and a few others started at the University of Georgia back in the late 1980s.
And sorry for the acronyms, but this is what happens when you spend much of the rest of your life either in and out of government or the UN. And but after 9/11, it was, I really kind of felt I really needed to maybe even try to have more impact. And I was asked into the Bush administration to be a special assistant to the Undersecretary of Commerce in the Bureau of Industry and Security, and did that. And like many people who work in these kind of situations, I left shortly, about 19, 20 months in, I went to, I was a scholar in residence at American University here there in Washington. And I hadn't done that for 2 months. In fact, the semester had not started when I got a call from the U.S. government asking me to be an expert to work on this resolution I had helped work on that was drafted by the UN Security Council. It's a resolution that deals with preventing terrorists from gaining access, or non-state actors from gaining access to weapons of mass destruction. And it's kind of hard to say no when you get technically nominated by Kofi Annan at the time as Secretary General. It's kind of hard to say no, so I did both roles for a while, and then just focused as time went on and the balance of work was such, I just focused on working for the UN Security Council as I was an expert for this committee.
I'd be delighted if you'd go into some detail about this work, because it's turned out historically, and as we get into more current events, our listeners will understand why, to be an extraordinarily important resolution and effort. And as I understand it, you were one of 4 experts. I believe there was one from Russia, maybe Germany, one from South America, Brazil. And tell us about what you experts for this committee working for the UN Security Council were charged with doing.
Well, the committee that we work for is a subsidiary body of the Security Council, so it's part of the Security Council. And the Security Council had passed this really unique resolution that required all UN member states, by law, it was binding obligation or binding requirements that covered more than 200 different obligations, things that they as states needed to do. Some things were prohibitions. States had to prohibit basically terrorists from getting weapons. They had to, they can't work on them, they can't use them, they can't finance them, all these things. They also then, because a lot of this, the technology involved is dual use, that it has both, it's primarily commercial or scientific, but it also has military applications. We needed to figure out ways, they had a lot of obligations related to managing those things. And then there were some things that were recommended, that we recommended states to do. And the Security Council originally asked all the member states to submit reports. That's often doesn't result in a lot of reports being submitted to the UN and other bodies, but and we did get about 100 states, I think, originally submitting reports, and the committee can't do this. So the council itself and the subsidiary bodies of the council, they're not full of experts. They are not in a position to really do this, so they frequently rely on others who do have the technical expertise, the subject matter expertise, to to help them in understanding what is going on. And that was our first task, was to go through all these reports and say, what's the status of implementation? So you got these 200 plus obligations. You knew that some states were doing them, were taking steps to prevent, let's say, financing of a weapon of mass destruction. Some states were doing those kinds of things, but many were not. And the committee wanted to kind of understand what was going on. And so our job was first to figure that out. And we did indeed. We also had a second problem, and that was to address the legitimacy of the resolution. It was so unique, and it had so many obligations, which UN Security Council resolutions rarely have so many specific obligations that are about what states need to do internally, that there was a concern that the Security Council had overstepped its bounds in this. So we had to address the legitimacy of what we were doing as well as the substance of monitoring what we were doing. And we came up with a method, the four of us. There was a Brazilian, a Russian, a German, and myself. Pretty quickly, we added a couple of others from a few other countries. Someone from Eritrea, who had been representative of the International Atomic Energy Agency here at the United Nations. But we had a few more experts eventually, and we came up with, through a variety of methods of testing, what was the best way to take these reports, which varied pretty much from 3 pages saying don't bother us to nearly 100 pages, almost all of which was irrelevant to the obligations. So we came up with a way to a matrix of questions we could ask and see if we could identify if a law or regulation, because that's what we focused on, that we couldn't focus on implementation because assessing implementation really takes many, many more resources and lots more money than we certainly had available to us. So we focused just on the legal regulatory elements of the requirements and developed a good system. And in fact, we feel it was good because when we sent it out to all the states, because nothing that we did was we didn't do things that weren't approved by the states. So we sent it out to all the states, this matrix, saying, this is what we think you're doing. And that was important, recognizing that many states, when they get a request for a report, it's some poor, I'll use the word schmuck from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs who doesn't know what the rest of the government is doing, because that's just not how governments are frequently designed. So it doesn't really have a great way to answer. So there was a fear originally by the committee that states would over-report, over-claim. And in fact, what we found was states, as we expected actually, were vastly under-reporting. So we were experts in different domains. We knew states were doing something. We'd get a report. It wouldn't say anything. So that really helped. When we sent this back out, states said, oh, this is what they want. Mm-hmm. And we got not only more reports, we got much higher quality. We got a 50% plus increase in information. Mm-hmm. It was much better. So we addressed the problem that way. So the committee had a better sense of what everybody was doing. Mm-hmm. The other question was legitimacy. Now this was harder because, in no small part, because the committee only had a 2-year mandate. So, and you can't presume the committee would continue. As it happens, they've extended the mandate several times, and it's gone, originally went 2 years, 2 years, 3 years, 10 years. Now we have another, it's gotten more 10 years, so we have continued increase in the length of the mandate. But it's, at the time, that would made it very hard for a lot of countries thinking, or international organizations in particular, thinking, why should we invest time in doing this work and helping people on this resolution number 1540, but why do we need to do that? And it took us some time. We decided that the way to go about this was to focus on regional organizations and a few of the very important functional organizations, international organizations, and get their support. Because in a regional organization or these functional organizations, states usually have to vote on things. And if we could get them to vote on fully supporting implementation of the resolution, we thought that would create a better sense of legitimacy, so that not only were the 15 states originally that are in the Security Council that voted for the resolution, not only did they support it, in the end, basically every state in the world has voted in a public place saying, in a political forum or an institutional forum saying, we fully support the resolution.
Let me just interject here and commend you and thank you, because this was an effort, and I've followed these issues over the years, that has made a real difference in a dangerous world. That the UN and key actors, governments around the world, know a lot more about what countries are doing and not doing to control the spread of the most dangerous things in the world. And we know that the world remains very challenging and dangerous, and it would be much more so without this effort that you and your team were involved in. So it's quite interesting that a student of the University of Georgia went on to play a role in this kind of work, and that this work continues to this day. Maybe later on we can assess where the world is today and how important, what kind of impact this has had. But tell us more. And then you continue with your work at the UN, but then you went to work with the State Department to continue this work on the national levels. Is that correct?
Right. So I was with the UN as an expert for the Security Council for 8 years. And in 2012, the person who had been sort of organizing the support for this resolution and in its work in the United States moved to another job. And so they asked me if I could come in and be the special coordinator for, and again, it's this resolution. I won't go into the name and everything, but because it's a long name, as the committee is, full name is actually a long one. So, and so I said I'd agree to do it, but I only wanted to do it to help get the United States and our allies, friends, partners, and everybody involved through what is called a second comprehensive review of the resolution. So there was an initial comprehensive review of the resolution in 2009, and then because of the way a new resolution extending the mandate of the committee, making it longer, said, well, we need another comprehensive review midway through this new mandate that was very long to say, is the committee, what's happening? Is it having an impact? What are we doing? So I promised to help say that I'll stay through that, and then I thought I'd retire from the State Department. And though I wanted to go to a think tank or continue my hand in it, teach an occasional class, and I had structured that so I would do that. So I got us through helped get the U.S. through this. Now we had a lot of support in some ways, and it was interesting for me. many people had started to see 1540 being an integral foundation to much of what was done, because this resolution creates the legal foundation for securing dangerous chemicals for nonproliferation purposes, securing biological agents and pathogens that might be used for biological weapons, dealing with ballistic missiles and unmanned air systems, the financing of any of these activities by non-state actors especially, but by, could be criminals, could be terrorist organization. That's all from this resolution. That's what this resolution makes makes these things essentially international law. And that helped prompt a lot of states, especially in this area of controlling and managing these dual-use technologies, also to create systems that had never done this before. And we had tried many years supporting the U.S. government or working with the U.S. government in many ways when we were at the center, trying to say, hey, you should really do this. This is in your interest to do. You will attract more technology if you have these. Really bad people won't get these things, or you'll help limit their ability to get these things if you set up these systems. That was difficult. We spent years in some cases when I was at the Commerce Department or the center trying to convince people in other countries that they needed to do this outside of our traditional partners and allies, mainly in Western Europe and a few others, and Japan, an example, but Brazil, Argentina, we sort of got everybody going. But in the end, by the time I was working at the UN, you could go to any country and say, no, this is not a U.S. Initiative. This is not a Western initiative. Indeed, at the time, Putin was one of the people who went to the UN and said, we need this. They were a co-sponsor of this resolution, the Russians.
And there was a high level of U.S.-Russian cooperation at that time. Is that right?
That's right, on this issue. And so we were able to then go to states where we had hoped, who had a lot of trade in these high-tech items, where there was a risk of diversion to people we didn't want them to see, and not just non-states. I will say this also addresses issues like items going to North Korea. Even though they're not sanctions, you need to have these systems in place if you want to have sanctions. If you want to implement sanctions, it's helpful to have these systems in place. So, it was much easier if you go in and say, no, it's not the UN, it's the UN. Everybody has already agreed this is important. Let's talk about how you can implement this and how we can facilitate implementation. So that made a big change. And as you may have seen, there's a number of states that adopted these kinds of controls. And in fact, if you can look at, there's now a 20-year history of the steps. Dozens of countries have taken dozens of measures where they specifically say we're doing this to implement the resolution. Now, they may be doing it for other reasons, but they at least put this at the foundation of, so it's integral. And I think during the second comprehensive review, we had some support from some high-level people, like the NSC director on WMD was Laura Holgate, Ambassador Holgate, and others sort of understood that this was something that kind of knitted a lot of these other arms control agreements or instruments, helped knit them all together in a way. So it was it was a useful time. But by 2016, relations, of course, with between the United States and the Russian Federation, and between many other countries in the Russian Federation, had degraded considerably. And those were very difficult negotiations. My wife remembers me lying on the floor because it caused back spasms for me, because and I'd be talking to people who would come out of the council building and say, say, this is what's going on, and we talk about what kind of strategy, or we'd go up there if this was unclassified, so it was, public, but we would also, and in classified settings, we'd also say, look, do this, do that, but they were very difficult. But we found a way through. Now, I will say from my perspective, the Russian Federation is backtracked on almost all of the things it agreed to do in 2016 in the resolution. So it's been very difficult. Now they have passed a new resolution again, extending some, talking about the mandate and things like that were also very difficult negotiations because the relationship is so bad at this point. So, but states can do things now because they set up systems, and many of these things aren't just. You think about technology. They are systems they've set in place. For example, securing chemicals that could be used for chemical weapons. Almost all of those are also environmentally hazardous. So setting up those systems, and that's just one example, one of many examples of how implementing the resolution and now doing some of the other things that I do supports things like the Sustainable Development Goals worldwide. And that's which is, I think, truly a way to change our thinking about this, because the Sustainable Development Goals are what the global majority, I think is the term we now use, the phrase, what they tend to see as important, is public health and getting clean energy, all sorts of things like that. The kind of work we do, and not just through the resolution, but implementing the resolution, and some of the other work is actually directly related to the Sustainable Development Goals. And so that resonates a little bit more to them. If they say, why should we do this? Yeah. Well, keeping really dangerous chemicals from polluting your rivers and environment and killing your people is probably a good reason. Yeah. And and we can help you.
I might just reflect here and add that this is really important work that most Americans and citizens of the world don't know about. Yep. These are the details of international relations and politics and diplomacy that are so difficult but so important to get things done. And a Georgian diplomat by the name of Stuart Eisenstadt recently wrote a book about the art of diplomacy. And there's a lot of diplomacy involved in this and working with countries that have vast differences of interests and so forth. And so I, again, want to commend you and your team. But because it's hard work, I understand you decided to take a break and go to a top think tank in Washington and continue that work in another way. Is that correct?
When I left the State Department, I went to the Henry L. Stimson Center in Washington, D.C., and indeed, in the global think tank ratings, it's rated quite highly for a very small organization, relatively small, to work on tools, basically, to help states and others implement these obligations or address issues. So one of the big issues for many states, despite them having maybe an interest in it and a willingness to adopt implementation measures, don't have the resources, don't have the either technical expertise or funding or whatever. So one of the things that I worked on was developing a database, a searchable database online of all the assistance programs related to nonproliferation of weapons of mass destruction, which can include things like, since we drove through Rockdale and Conyers on the way here, happened to see on my phone, we got an alert about a fire in a biolab, and at least an alleged fire in a biolab, but it was certainly an alert on my work phone. And that's an important part of thinking about how do we, how do we address some of these concerns. So it was helping states with securing or making their bio labs safe. That would be a kind of an assistance program that we would do. So we made a database for that. It is now currently used by the group of 7 states, global partnership, which is a larger number of states, but it's mainly the states involved in providing assistance related to nonproliferation. They now use it themselves as an online database tool. But then we also, I also help put together programs on a legal database for securing radiological materials, and working with Pacific Northwest Nuclear Labs and others. And that's, one of the things that, that's something that interests every state in the world, interests many, many people, because every state has, in many cases, can be hundreds of thousands of radioactive sources and use them. They use them in things, I think many people may be familiar with the health things when you get an x-ray or things like that, or you go to the dentist and, but there's also in, it covers things like oil exploration that's used to help understand what is in the well that you might be digging. It's also used to look at buildings and safety of building structures. So they're everywhere. Every state has them. They move across borders a lot, but it's really in your interest to make sure there's a good regulatory structure. People die from people abandoning, for example, radioactive sources in scrap yards. People because if there's not a good, let's say, public health system, they may not recalibrate the x-ray machines that they have or the machines they use for cancer therapy. These are things that are important to everyday life. They deal with lots of jobs. So, and we do, think about that a lot, about how does this create and maintain jobs here in the United States as well as elsewhere. And so we did look at radioactive sources because that didn't exist, that kind of database. It mainly focused on special nuclear materials, those that go in a atomic bomb. So we did that. We also we came up with a tool using combining chemistry and information technology to help customs officers identify this is a chemical we should be worried about that's coming into our country. So it doesn't, yes, it was designed to keep it from going from terrorists or others, but it's also helps us understand what's coming into a country. When you think of hurricanes coming through, as we clearly the devastation that occurred most recently here in Georgia, but I also have noted having discussions with, let's say small island states that suffer hurricanes, and one of the issues they frequently face is because they haven't noticed that this is a dangerous chemical, and it goes somewhere, it's stored somewhere, and they don't know where it is, what's happened. How do you, we didn't even know it was here because we weren't tracking it. That can have a substantial environmental impact and harm the economy and harm the people involved, as it does here in the United States when we see chemical spills and things like that. So we really, that we did a lot of those kind of tools to help people, and they were usually tools that had that different kind of impact. It was not just helping prevent terrorists and criminals and sometimes Iran or DPRK from getting things. It was also, they almost invariably also had a positive impact on development. Like, particularly we see it in public health. There's helping to secure a biological laboratory, for example. So,
but then you got called back into government recently.
Well, someone I had worked with before, she was our ambassador for threat reduction in the Obama administration. I really admired, and she was made the Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security. This is Ambassador Bonnie Jenkins, the first woman of color to have that post. And she originally, we got in touch talking about having me on an International Security Advisory Board, which is an advisory board for the Secretary of State, but works through the Undersecretary. And that was about the same time that Russia expanded its invasion in Ukraine. So things were heating up quite a bit. And again, I felt kind of some responsibility that maybe I could help out. And in fact, eventually it was, well, why don't you just come into the front office and be a senior advisor for her? And that's what I have done. And I've done that for it's more than a year and a half anyway now. And but we'll soon leave again because it's just, you can only do so much. And so I may stay around with the State Department in a limited capacity, not a full-time capacity, and also may work at a think tank also in a limited capacity, but we'll see.
The span of your work over 40 years after starting as a student at the University of Georgia and then coming back here, and I know you met with students at the University of Georgia this morning at the Center for International Trade and Security that you helped create. Let's bring it back to the university and our involvement in creating this new center of a new kind. We brought together the ideas of trade, technology, security, and international relations in a way that others weren't really thinking about. And I'm wondering, we might just reflect together a bit. Did we know what we were doing? Did we know how important this would be in the year 2024 and looking forward? Because you can't pick up a international or national newspaper without seeing these issues played out in real life. You cannot get involved or hear a conversation of experts in Washington about the role of technology and chips and dealing with the Chinese and so forth. Could you say a few words about what was started then and what we have now at the University of Georgia in this Center for International Trade and programs like the Undergraduate Security Leadership Program and the Graduate Program and International Policy, where this can help out and what Georgia has here today that is of value to what's going on in Washington and the real world?
It's a good question. Did we know what we were doing? But you and I had been working on technology transfer issues, I think going back to the 70s. I think I was recalling, I saw Senator Talmadge's seat out there. We went and interviewed Senator Talmadge early on, if you recall. That was, so it was an interesting issue. And then especially, I think, during the Reagan administration, there was a Operation Exodus that you needed to pay more attention to what was going on, items going to the Soviet Union. There were a lot of technology going to the Soviet Union, and then there was a big case in the Japanese and Norwegian companies got in serious trouble because they sent a particular piece of technology that was related to submarine propellers, and that cost, I think, the U.S. about $30 billion in order to create the new measures they had to create in order to address this new, more quieter submarine. And so there was there was some interest, and the Japanese were very interested in it. But also, I think, Dean Rusk, former Secretary of Rusk, but he's, was encouraged, I think, people to think a bit about that, think more about that. And he said, you've got several people here at the university who are interested in this. So if I recall correctly, he urged you to put together a center. And you did. And coming back, that was one of the things that drew me back here to Georgia. And we, in my mind, we got some initial support from the university to help have an administrative assistant and do a couple of other things. Historically, I think we may have discussed state universities often have a hard time. They'll often suggest to a professor that they start a center and say, fine, you can start a center, you should start a center, but then they won't give them any money. So it's pretty much impossible to, they're asking the impossible in many ways. But and it came together. You got some, some very good support from some individuals and foundations, and that came together. And for me, one of the things that I have found historically is, and it reaches back to that, was putting something like that together, putting an institution together is really one of the more, could be very tiring and difficult, but one of the more exciting things you can do. So working on Resolution 1540, before that I worked on the Proliferation Security Initiative, helping deal with that, and worked a lot with the Financial Action Task Force on creating a new way of thinking about financing of proliferation. What do we actually do? Those kinds of things are some of the most fun things you can do in government. Nuclear Security Summit stuff, those are fun. I mean, it's hard, but you feel creative. It allows you to be creative. So, and I think we may not have known all that we were doing, but it gave us a place to be creative, and we attracted money from foundations that were interested in this, and we developed new tools for government, not only just bringing people together. That's kind of that convening power is something that a lot of centers, I think a lot of universities do, but we also created practical tools in the center's case, started a process that created a very practical tool about how do we measure implementation of export controls? Do they exist? How do we do that? And that tool essentially is still used by the State Department today. So that's an example of, it's an idea, it was an idea, and then we did something practical with it. That's really hard to do in government. So having places outside of government that can do that, and is really helpful, and know how to communicate those ideas that are practical. So sometimes I hear from maybe in the academic field, sometimes I'll see somebody write something, and I know everybody, including myself, everybody in my office is just going to look at that and say, that's what a total non-starter. Why do we even, but creating those practical tools is really, that's really helpful, because people just don't have time usually to think, and that's why the national laboratories are helpful, and academia is helpful. Industry sometimes can do the same, but coming up with those ideas, and not just the abstract idea, but some practical way. That also means you really have to understand the policy and the programs and the activities. So you have to understand that you have to develop a real expertise. Sometimes that's easier to maintain in an academic setting, that people can continue, if they're passionate and committed to something, they can work on it for a long time. That's sometimes hard in government, because people change jobs, or you get some directive from the White House or somewhere else and say, no, you're going to focus on this. So that's something there. Also, and this is true, I think, more broadly of non-government organizations, nonprofits, but it's also true in an academic research setting, we could react faster than the government can. The government comes in with more money, more legitimacy. Sometimes we'd have to say, okay, they'd say, "Who are you guys?" No, we could move fast. I can think of one example in particular is the fall of the Soviet Union. We had already planned a conference to bring the Central European states together in Poland to talk about developing new export controls or how they might manage because all of them had dual-use equipment that we didn't want to have going to terrorists, so we were afraid that, or going to North Korea or elsewhere to create these kinds of systems. So we already had that in place, and then the former Soviet Union collapses, and the State Department comes to us that we are prohibited by law from funding anything. We can't get any of these people to talk about export controls, but they all need to talk about export controls because they all have stuff. And we were able through our, in the private foundation, we're able to bring them in which was a big favor to government. This is not something that never happens. This happens a lot.
It was you and I.
Yeah, well then. Yeah.
We went to Warsaw and said, we've got to bring these. This is a good central place. And we organized this effort. We used the old Communist Party meeting grounds outside of Warsaw. We had ambassadors sleeping together from different countries in joint rooms because we didn't have enough room for all of them. Even the Communist Party of Poland didn't have enough accommodations for bringing all of these people. We invited them from Belarus, Ukraine, Kazakhstan. Many of them got in their cars and drove there for the first time across international borders. And we sat down for close to 3 days. And I'm glad you reminded me of this. I'm out of date on a lot of things, but this was rewarding work. And I was also pleased to hear you say that the Department of State is still using the measuring technique on export control development that came out of it. And this was developed by students. You and other students, and you came back after being a student here, but worked with these students. I often say that it was the students of the University of Georgia who built the Center for International Trade and Security because we didn't have enough faculty involved. And so we turned to outstanding graduate students and increasingly undergraduate students. And they made a real difference. And we got involved in some very exciting work, and they got involved in some.
Yeah, and can I just one other program that comes to mind. Because of some of our work, we were interviewing people in Washington. So I remember interviewing somebody with the Department of Energy, and we're talking about what some of our students were doing and what we were interested in. And they said, we have this program out in Los Alamos where we bring engineering nuclear physicists to this program. They get several months training at Los Alamos National Laboratory, and then they do several months in Washington, D.C., and rotate through a couple of departments. And they said, do you guys want to, we need some social scientists who actually might know, we had we had students that spoke Russian and worked and were willing to go to the countries. And he said, and it turned out we were able to start this process of getting people who were working in this field into this program, which paid a considerable sum of money, I would say, at the time. Certainly as a graduate student, you would find yourself, you were making a lot. And what they did was go out to Los Alamos, then they came in to Washington, D.C. and went through and then they went out and usually were with, like, say, the atomic energy agencies in Kazakhstan and in Ukraine and elsewhere, and helped develop relations that actually served the United States quite well, but also them. Some wrote their PhDs based on that experience, and Many have gone on to do some pretty amazing things, but that program actually now, it expanded so that it was first just us, and then Monterey, which is now Middlebury College Center for Nonproliferation Study, I think they got added in. And then, only then did Harvard and Stanford and a couple of the others get added in. And now it's a much bigger program, and it's still active. People are still doing that. Yeah. They've switched it a little bit. I think they don't rotate through the different agencies, but there's still, that program is still there. And that was in part because it worked because we had good students who could do that.
I remember that meeting in Baldwin Hall, and I think we sent the first 6 or 8 UGA graduate students who were the first ones to really be involved in that, and it kick-started their careers, and it's pleasing to know that program is still existent. Well, in starting to wrap things up here, so students then and now coming out of the University of Georgia have a role to play in this field. Can you comment just a little bit about the need for young people to get involved in the challenging area of arms control and international security, nonproliferation, strategic trade, export controls? What is the need? What is the role of a place like the Center for International Trade and Security at the University of Georgia for helping prepare the future generations?
For me, in many parts of the nonproliferation field, in many of the areas that we work, it was already, when you and I were both much younger, it was already dominated by people who were old white men. That was who was at all the meetings. And those generations are dying off. And now we brought in new people, but we're still looking to find, in order to keep this expertise or acquire the expertise, one, they've got to, we need people who get prepared in these areas and become subject matter experts, or at least curious and interested and start to be passionate about it, so they want to become this, so that they can be the next generation of people who come in and deal with these issues. So, and it's a much more diverse community. We're really, I think that's, you can see it now. There's much more focus. So the UN and the International Atomic Energy Agency and the Chemical Weapons Convention and the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, they are all got youth initiatives. They're all trying to bring people in. And in some of those, the center and Georgia University have played an important part, for instance, in helping to establish the International Nuclear Security Education Network that's used by the International Atomic Energy Agency. I think Georgia had an important role, the center had an important role in its early years. And these are the things that, they came about not because the International Atomic Energy Agency thought, oh, this is we'll be nice. No, it came about because they know they need people to be regulators. They need people, this is their workforce, future workforce. They need people. We have much the same issue. We have lots of pressing concerns related to, let's say, semiconductor, how we manage trade in semiconductors, let's say with some strategic competitors, which we usually talk not just about, well, mainly about China, but also Russian Federation. I can't go into great detail, but clearly we are, we need people who can do that. And these are not issues that are going away anytime soon. In fact, there are probably more of them as we have more technologies to deal with. And so I was really encouraged to see today, I saw some engineering student in the CITS and, bringing in some more of these fields. That's really creating that, you're helping to create a workforce. So one of the things that I work on now, and I can't go into, again, detail on this, I've worked on it for basically, since I got there, I spent a lot more time on this. This is AUKUS, the Australian, U.S., UK-U.S. New kind of relationship. One of the big issues is developing the workforce that can help us work together in, especially in new and emerging technologies, but also just submarine technology. Is it how do we create that workforce? And there are universities that are doing this, but they need, the center is another place that they can help create that workforce, that can help think about, and in the center's case, not just the technical parts, but linking the technical parts with the policy parts, and how do we do this? I was having lunch the other day with a former student and collaborator at the Center for International Trade and Security. She's worked at the State Department for a long time, helping other states develop export controls, and now she's just became the new Deputy Assistant Secretary over at Commerce for Strategic Trade Management, and it's for strategic trade. Thinking about, we had discussions quite a while ago saying, we need more people. They want people to come in. They need people. We want to hire people who know how to do this. And there's almost never enough. This is one of those areas I teach occasionally at law schools and others, and I keep saying, why aren't you doing more courses on this? Because everybody gets hired who does these jobs. This is, but it's really a place you can generate ideas and new people coming in and getting a passion for the work, and it's important work. It's what it keeps. I can't say it keeps you keep the worst weapons from the worst hands. That was a phrase we used to use sometimes at State. It keeps the worst weapons from the worst hands.
Well, thank you, Rick. It was good to have you back on campus and good to talk to you today. And as we wrap this up, is there anything I haven't asked that you'd like to talk about or mention, or shall we call it a day?
Just how important, not only for me this was, but I think the creation of the institution was really, it was really important for the work that was done on export controls. It was, it's not the only, Center is not the only group working on this, but I would say certainly at a period of time it was the world's leading body. It may still be doing work on this outside of government. It's spawned journals. We've got, it's spawned all sorts of things that have grown out of this, and it shows what I think you can do. If there's some people who are really interested, you got support from Secretary Rusk, from Dean Rusk, and others here at the university originally. You got some key, that was a key thing, getting some funding, but it's also the students. It was just getting and attracting good students to work on this, and I'd say a lot of them have gone on and done really interesting things, and it's been a pleasure to work with them. And and I like to think it was all a credit to the university because of that, because of the work that was done. So.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
It's been a pleasure talking with you, and we look forward to more people like you coming out of the University of Georgia.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a great pleasure, and go Dogs.
Yeah, thank you.